It is important that you're there because we need to make quorum and also get your opinions. But it's also, if you're not a member of the church and you want to stay and join us, it's a good way of understanding how the church works and what's happening. And still, your voice is important. Even if you're a regular member of the church but not a member on the books, your voice is still welcome. If you're not familiar with the United Church of Christ polity, the way we govern ourselves, we're governed by our church council. The church council only has the power you give it at today's meeting. The church council has to operate within a budget that you vote on today. The church council has to work on missions, goals, objectives that you vote on today. So our church council doesn't run the church. Our congregation runs the church at the meetings we have, which is why there's a quorum, right? So that 3 people can't get together and say they have a meeting and represent the church. No. If the majority aren't there, it doesn't count, to make sure everybody has a voice, right? So this meeting is important because it's your way, it's our way. By the way, it's the only church meeting I get a vote in as a church member. I don't vote on council. I have a vote in this meeting. It's our way as a church family of telling council, this is what we elected you to do. Okay? So it's like our national government. If you don't like the way your leaders run the government, tell them, this is how we do it at church council. Okay? It's really important. All right. This week in Bible prophecy. Not something you usually hear from the pulpit here. Have you seen the show? Please don't. Please don't watch. It's scary. It's not real. You see, there are certain parts of Christianity that I'm going to tell you right now I think are fairly spiritually unhealthy. And I'm just going to be rude enough to call them out. Because they're meant to scare the hell out of you, not love the heaven into you. And I don't think that's a healthy spirituality. I don't know that Jesus ever was big about fear. My own general druthers as a pastor is that when something smells like fear, I immediately sort of run. Because Jesus never said, come unto me, all of you who are afraid of hell. Jesus said, come unto me, all of you who are weak and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. It's not about fear. But today's scriptures are pretty scary. And they're often used as a way of beating fear into people, and quite frankly, at the risk of being offensive, it's manipulative. It's spiritual abuse. Because it's not what the scriptures mean. Let me explain. Our church year is coming to an end. Our church year goes Advent to Advent. Not January to January. You'll hear about that next week as we come to the Feast of Christ the King, our last Sunday of the year, in preparation for Advent. Today's scriptures, as we move toward the end of the year, they begin to bring us to what we call the eschaton. In theological terms, that's the end of time, the apocalypse, if that doesn't make you shudder. You see, Israel has lived in fear. In exile, loss of land, loss of covenant, loss of identity. In our disciple Bible study, we're talking about the issue of covenant. And the 3 things, I will not quiz the people in disciple, but the 3 things that Abraham was promised as a sign of the covenant of God was land, seed, and promise. Blessing. We need a promised land. We need a people, descendants as numerous as the stars, and we need the blessing to be God's chosen ones. That's what identified Israel. And for generations, they felt lost because their land was taken. They were exiled at the hands of others. And their promise of being God's people, they didn't see as lived out anymore. Where was God in the midst of this destruction? Where was God in the midst of everything we've ever hoped and believed being taken away from us? What does it mean to be God's people when God seems so distant? In today's lesson from Isaiah, we actually read from what's called the third part of Isaiah, 3rd Isaiah. We actually think there may have been more than one book of Isaiah that got put together. And in 3rd Isaiah, we see the restoration of Israel. God's promise of restoration is new. In the gospel lesson today, we see Jesus talking about the loss of the temple. Again, the promise of identity for the people of Israel. War, earthquake, famine, destruction. But the end, he says, shall not follow immediately. The end, wait a minute, that's the key. But the end will not follow immediately. What does that mean for us? If we read Isaiah, it means in the end, everything is restored, doesn't it? In the end, the sin, the hate, the pain are restored. The grief and the fear, they're defeated and restored to normal again. In the end, God wins. Sometimes you need to wait till the end, don't you? To get the restoration to what needs to really be right. It happens in our great detective stories. It happens in our scriptures. I used to laugh, I think I may have told you this, I used to laugh in seminary when they would, like churches would sing, "A mighty fortress is our God," and the service is running long, so we want to cut the verses, and we just sing the first and second verse. If you read "A mighty fortress is our God," Martin Luther's great hymn, you have to sing all the verses, because until the last verse, Satan wins. It's only in the last verse of "A mighty fortress is our God" that Jesus actually prevails. And so it's important to sing the end of the story. Sometimes you can't judge the story halfway through. It's a rough world we live in. And sometimes it just seems to be getting rougher. Economic crash 10 years ago, rising gun violence, international tensions, wars, not to mention all the personal stuff we go through every single week. But that's not the focus of the readings today, as much as some people might want us to think it is. The focus is on the end. The focus is on that one little contraction. But, that conjunction, the end comes after. But, that's the whole point of the story, isn't it? In that word. This is reality, but things will be restored. In the end, God wins. In the end, God restores that which is God's vision for the world. With the economy, God restores. With your finances or your job, God restores. With your nation, God restores. With an impeachment, God restores. With your doctor's report, God restores and wins if we wait for the end of the story. What does the end look like? Isaiah tells us it's a reversal of what we have known. The exiled in Isaiah will own land. That's not a coincidence. Those who've been shuffled from land to land, not knowing where they'll be, not knowing what will happen to them, will own their own property. They'll plant crops, and they'll be settled long enough to receive their yield. That means they're going to settle in. They're not just going to plant their gardens, they'll be around in the summertime to get it back. The lion will lay down with the lamb. Those who were mortal enemies, those who were prey, will seek justice and peace. They'll trade swords for plowshares. Weapons of destruction will be weapons that give life. War and destruction will be turned into life. I read a story this week that may or may not be true, probably isn't. During World War II, a man came out of a bomb shelter in London, and he saw a very elderly newspaper man on the side of the sidewalk selling newspapers. "Buddy, who won the battle last night?" The man said, "I don't know, mister. I just sell newspapers. I don't really read them." He said, "You know, I don't really care who wins the battles, because I know who wins the war." That's what the scriptures are telling us. It doesn't matter who wins the battles because we know who wins the war. These scriptures, this end of the church year emphasis on the end is not meant to be an episode of Christological fear factor. This is not the church's way of covering you with snakes and spiders and saying, are you ready to say your prayers yet and get into heaven? That's not what this is about. It's only scary if you focus on the now. It's not scary if you focus and know the end of the story. And in the end, God wins. But that's so much easier said than done, isn't it? It's so much easier to trust in God's providence in our life when we're in the middle of the storms. It's so much harder to trust God's will when we know that our life is shaking around us. It's easier said than done, this whole trusting thing. And that's why we tell our story. We tell our story over and over and over again, every year, from Advent to Christmas to Epiphany, to Lent to Easter to Pentecost. We rehearse the magnificent acts of a loving God in our midst over and over and over again, like Israel gathered around the Paschal feast, remembering the Passover, every Seder meal. We gather as a people of faith at a table surrounding each other, encouraging each other, and reminding each other of a story that says that when the world around us shakes, that's not the end of the story. When our life crumbles, when relationships fail, when our future is unsure, that's just this chapter. But we know the end. The story of a God whose love overcame our brokenness and the sin of the world to bring us healing, wholeness, and hope. Elsewhere in the scriptures, Jesus says this: when you see these signs, look up. Keep your eyes toward heaven, for your redemption draws near. You see, in the end, God wins. Amen.